for the student on the way, they very quickly learn, hopefully, or they're not on the way, that many of their assumptions are just flat out wrong. That the world is not organized the way they imagine, that their mind is not organized the way they imagine, that what people have told them is not true, and that you can't make any assumptions. It's just like a scientist or a scientist or a great artist. You don't make assumptions. You work from first principles. But in this case, your assumptions that you are an ego, that you were born and you're going to die. The assumption that your mind is like encased in some kind of bone bowl. The limits of your mind, what you were here for, where you're going, all of these are assumptions. And for the most part, they're all wrong. What have you learned?
A bunch of things. One of them is how narrowly I've been looking at the world, where my assemblage point is. It's starting to make more sense.
Okay. And so you've broadened your view of the world. You've broadened your POV, your point of view.
Yes, and continuing to broaden it some more. I think it's still pretty narrow.
Okay. And you wanted to talk about the four agreements, is that correct?
Yes, but I had a question first before that about something you posted.
Okay, that's fine. And then I don't have a copy of the four agreements. So that book keeps getting. The day I buy a copy, within a week, I've kind of given it away, and so it's really hard to keep a copy of. But okay,
Yeah,
let's go to the question. So just know that I don't have a copy. Okay.
sure.
What's the question?
So a couple weeks ago, you posted about a psychological process called projective identification,
Yes, very important.
which, yeah, I had heard of something like this, maybe in my introductory psych classes, but I didn't really. I had to look online to actually figure out what it was. It was a little more complicated than I originally thought. So your post says the well-known psychological process of projective identification can be dangerous, especially politically. It's where a person projects their unwanted feelings onto another, who then unconsciously adopts and acts out these feelings, creating a pathological dynamic. So could you, one, explain it, and two, give an example?
Okay, good question. Projective identification was first, as far as I know, first identified and clarified by Melanie Klein, the great British psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, and she focused on children. But then this process became apparent clinically when working with severely character disordered folks, people with borderline characters or narcissistic characters, especially, but mainly borderline. But you could see it in other forms in even normal people, because even people without those conditions, because the process is unconscious on both sides. And it works like this. Let's say someone's really convinced that the world is unfair to them, and that the reason the world is unfair to them is because they're always angry. And you take a young therapist, and although everything's sweetness and roses on the surface, underneath, let's say the client, the patient, is actually full of unconscious anger, or anger she doesn't want to have revealed, or anger that is very destructive. This gets projected onto the therapist. And the therapist protests, "No, I'm not angry. I'm just trying to help. I'm just here to help." And I'm grossly oversimplifying. And this topic could easily take an hour. It could easily take a semester. of work, because it's a important and neglected process. Anyway, so the patient unknowingly creates a situation to make the therapist angry. Maybe it's by insisting that the therapist is angry. Maybe it's by acting out in some other way. And to make a long story short, before you know it, the unconscious, aggressive, destructive feelings of anger have been transferred to the therapist. They're still in both places, but they've been transferred to the therapist, and then the therapist starts acting out as if she's angry. And she may do things like terminate, or like abruptly go on a vacation and not tell the client, or forget an appointment or something like that. Very, very aggressive or angry. But it's an unconscious mechanism. And this is a very, very oversimplified version of it. But that's the gist of it. The transferring of an unconscious, or let's say someone's racist. Someone has deeply disavowed, hidden, and unconscious racist feelings. They can't allow themselves to know consciously that they have them. So they unconsciously project them onto someone else. And they do it in such a manner and so consistently enough to where it engenders dislike, which looks like racism. And before you know it, the process is made conscious, so it can be worked with, but the therapist has to be very, very aware that this process exists, and when this process is going on, because it's not just clients or patients that act out. And sometimes the therapist will take it home and get angry with their husband, right? Instead of so it's exactly that. And so what happens is the client ends up creating the very thing that they unconsciously don't want to see. Maybe it's anger in the therapist, or maybe it's prejudice in the therapist. And the therapist must be aware of these things. I mean, of these processes, that they exist, and be very vigilant to make sure that they don't act out on them. And they take them into account.
Could I ask a clarifying follow-up question?
Sure, but let's not go too deep into psychology, because, I suppose we could. But let's go ahead.
Well, this one should be quick, because I've just heard, I think this word gets jumbled, because this is one that lay people like to take from the psychological or psychiatric domain. And so my understanding is hazy. When you say projected, is that explicit, like the patient comes in and explicitly starts accusing the therapist of being angry in a back and forth? Or that also... No,
it's not. It's usually not explicit at all.
Okay.
It's unconscious, okay. And it's unconscious on both sides. And one of the things that folks don't really understand the way they should these days is that unconscious means unconscious. That means walled away, and it's not going to be gotten to unless there's some real effort on both sides. But dreams or free associations or acting out behaviors, they can reveal it.
Mm-hmm.
Slips of the tongue in some situations.
That's helpful. Okay, that's what I wanted to know about that.
Question.
So I've been thinking a lot more recently about Don Miguel Ruiz's formulation, which is a Toltec formulation called the Four Agreements. Mm-hmm. He released a book in, I think, 1997 for the general population. And it took like fire. A lot of people are very interested in it. I also recommend it to people.
A surgeon.
And it's called a practical...
It's important. For me, it's important to recognize that he's a surgeon, and it goes to show that people, they wall themselves off into one specialty or another. But here's a Mexican surgeon writing a book that is undeniably a real jewel.
I forgot about that, actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's called A Practical Guide to Personal Freedom, a Toltec Wisdom Book, The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz from 1997. Um, so this book, like I said, was widely circulated and it became popular just for everybody from children to adults. But I was hoping that we could look at the Four Agreements, since it is from the Toltec tradition, from the perspective of students of the way,
Okay,
as
good.
opposed to just a personal self-development book.
Good idea. Because it's of all of, I mean, I've read a lot of books in my long life, my ancient life, but this book is probably the best intro to Buddhism and to Dharma in general, and to the Toltec traditions of any of them. It's short, it's sweet, it's to the point, it's easy to read, it's popular among everybody from business people to, new age people and everybody in between. And so I highly recommend, if you haven't read it and you're interested in something like this, it's a highly, highly useful, highly, highly accessible little gem of an intro to Dharma or to Buddhism or to Taoism or to any number of depth traditions. Okay, where shall we start?
I'm debating whether it's important to start with his introduction about the domestication of the planet or just to stick with the agreements themselves.
I think let's stick with the agreements. He he took quite a bit of liberty in narrating an origin story for man and the universe, as I recall, and that's fine, that's good, but that's really at the level of legend or that's just one particular take on it. At the same time, I don't want to ruin it for people. I also want people to know that there's ways to go deeper on those subjects.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, then let's look at the agreements. So he presents them in the order of: first, be impeccable with your word; two, don't take anything personally; three, don't make assumptions; and four, always do your best. And he calls the first one, in fact, the most important, at least from his perspective, which is be impeccable with your word.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
I was going to say, obviously, from the self-development perspective, he provides a lot of that in the book, which is, I mean, the common things that would come up with being impeccable with your word, which are like, don't lie, don't slander other people,
Right.
don't lie to yourself, don't be conniving in that way.
So let's
But
go
I'd
ahead.
like to go further.
Right. Okay.
No, I
So
was just saying I'd like to go further.
okay, good. So obviously, being honest is foundational. I mean, you can't really live a life well without a lot of honesty. And so, but because you can't build trust, you can't build relationships, you can't do well in almost anything that involves other people if you're not honest. So let's focus on something else, which is honesty with yourself, being impeccable with your word with yourself. Because this can be a very powerful and useful practice, although a little bit nuanced. Sooner or later, regardless of what tradition you're in, it will be suggested that you not follow your thoughts, that you not be attached to concepts or constructs or be attached to anything for that matter, and that you take charge of your mind rather than letting your mind have charge over you by by not letting it just run rampant. Everybody from Krishnamurti to the sixth patriarch to the Sufis to wherever you want to turn, to even Don Juan and his buddies, being able to quiet the mind by not following one thought with another. And so to say to not have thought, I mean, that's an advanced exercise and you can do it for a while. and it's very, very nice. But as a practical matter in this world, thoughts are going to arise. And so the trick would be, just because a thought has arisen doesn't mean you have to follow it up with another thought. And this is a very practical and pragmatic way to quiet the mind by not following your thoughts. Now, the problem is that the mind or the brain or something likes to think. And so once it gets on a train of thought, the train keeps rolling. And so to be impeccable with your word, you must be impeccable with your word to yourself. And so as you're observing your mind, be honest. Were you attracted to that thought? Were you attracted to the opposite of that thought? Are you actually following that thought? Are you adding fuel to a fire that you don't need or want? And so I would say for Dharma students, at a certain level, the key would be to be impeccable with your word to yourself, assuming all the other stuff you're going to do, because if you don't, your life will be chaos. So impeccability with yourself would mean being honest in terms of your relationship to thought. Now, what people do at first, I'm an old man, I've been through all this stuff, is they go to war. They go to war with desire and they go to war with thought. And all that does is create a big mess. So it's something that must be gentle, something that must be sincere, something that must be consistent, and it's a habit that builds up over a lifetime. Now, no one's going to be perfect, and so you try, and then you try again, and then you keep trying, and you keep trying, and pretty soon you build up this capacity to not only observe your thoughts as they arise, but to, at another level altogether, decide, I'm tired of following these thoughts because there's no peace of mind in thought. Furthermore, and we may get to this later, the whole notion of self is tied in with thought. And this is something Krishnamurti is very big on. That without thought, there's no self, because the self is a thought. But maybe we'll get to that later. Does that help with the first agreement?
That does. I have a couple questions.
All right, follow-ups.
So one thought I've had is about transmuting or refining thoughts from one form into another.
Exactly.
Meaning,
go ahead.
If you thought of the storehouse of thoughts you have, for example, people think of the same thoughts repeatedly.
That you have? Are you sure they're yours?
What?
Most thoughts aren't really yours. Most thoughts come from the ambient noosphere or the repository consciousness or something like that. They're not all that original.
Right.
They just
Thank
it's
you
like
for the
taking little
clarification.
tinker toys and you put them together in different ways, but it's all tinker toys.
That might actually help answer this question. So there's a body of thoughts in the noosphere, basically. A lot of them are jealousies is a common one. Or,
do you want to explain to folks what the noosphere is, or look up the definition so people know what we're talking about?
I'll look up the definition. Otherwise,
this is especially important in these days of tech, because we're basically digitalizing the noosphere, and including a lot more. In addition to digitalizing it, we're making it visual and dynamic, and energizing it more than maybe is good for us.
So I have a couple definitions. Let's try to get one that's appropriate. The noosphere is a philosophical concept developed and popularized by the biogeochemist Vladimir Vernadsky and philosopher and Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Right.
Vernadsky defined Vernadsky defined the noosphere as the new state of the biosphere and described it as the planetary sphere of reason.
Yeah, that's a little bit. That let's just go to Tiag
Yeah.
de
How
Chardin.
about
That one's
uh,
too dense and obtuse. It's true that this Russian had some concept. He's Russian, correct?
yeah, I think so, but I
He
wouldn't.
had a
Yeah, maybe.
a preliminary notion of this, but this has been around. This has been around since
Yeah.
at least 2 millennia. So, but let's go to Teilhard de Chardin. That's easier for folks and better.
A postulated sphere or stage of evolutionary
All
development
right,
dominated by
let's just
conscious.
forget Wikipedia or whatever that is. Forget the internet. Whether it's evolutionary
Okay.
or not
All
is a
right.
wide open question. Basically, it just refers to the kind of the cloud of thought that surrounds our planet. It's a way of visualizing it. But what it is a cloud of thoughts that we share. Right? We share thoughts about political entities. We share thoughts about money. We share thoughts about good and bad, and we share thoughts about sexual uh, gender, and
Oh,
all these things are just the collective psyche of the
yeah.
planet, right? So
This one,
let's just define it as a collective psyche of the planet, and leave the internet to the internet. People want to
okay.
add things, it's really unfortunate. Okay, so let's keep going. Let's not get off track.
Right. Sure. So in that noosphere, there's obviously a host of thoughts. Things like jealousies, things like self-satisfactions, things like attachment to whatever.
Cars and trees and
My que-
birds, and eagles are
yeah,
good,
yeah.
crows are bad.
But the
Dragons, dragons are part of
yeah,
that only exists in the noosphere. All right, go ahead.
the from the individual body's perspective, like one person,
Mm-hmm.
the kinds of thoughts that pass through or that come around are different at different points in that body's life. So when I was younger, I had a lot more of the impulsive, intrusive thoughts like, oh, what if I, people have these thoughts like, oh, what if I screamed this bad word right here? Or what if I like punched this person in the face? Things like that. And I just don't get those kinds of impulsive thoughts very often anymore. Whereas I used to get them a lot or
Okay.
more often. Um, and then now I get thoughts that I wouldn't get in the past that are more like counsels that almost sound like uh, I don't know, like Idris Shah is speaking in my ear, or Thomas Cleary is speaking in my ear, or somebody else is speaking in my ear. So this
Yeah, because
seems
you
like
using your free will, you've you've selected a subset of the noosphere that will be more salutary, that will be more constructive, that's more towards the line of building of a foundation for a life, and you've voluntarily chosen to be surrounded by some of that and not just the garbage that's floating around in the noosphere, right?
right.
Racism,
Yes.
nationalism, capitalism, communism, whatever you want. It's just it's all just kind of basically garbage from the point of view of
Yeah.
developing of a developing soul. So okay, good, you've done that. Now you've
So
noticed an effect
my
too.
question is,
That's why
of
reading
course,
sutra. That's why reading good books. That's why listening to nourishing YouTubes, or watching something, or art or music, something that nourishes the spirit. That's why that's good for you. Is because your little subset of the repository consciousness, the collective consciousness, is healthier and more developmental. It's really straightforward, and people don't get that, and so they while away their 20s watching, admittedly, very engaging and beautiful video games, but that they haven't built a foundation, and now their worldview is colored by video games, or Reddit or 4chan or whatever, and then they're helpless in the real world. Okay, so it's important to birds of a feather flock together. It's important to hang out with people you'd rather be like than people that you don't even know, or people who are only interested in getting you to pay the next few tokens for the next few rounds of the video game. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And I say this only because
Yes.
people are getting confused about free will, and that's just too bad. Okay. Sorry for the preaching, but go ahead.
Okay. No, that's helpful. My next question, still on being impeccable with your word, ties more into Jesus's quote, "It's not what goes into the mouth of man that defiles him, but what comes out of the mouth of man."
Yeah.
So what about using your word on the way? Not just don't slander other people, but
Well, that's part of basic.
like
That's part
Zen.
of
Yeah.
basic Dharma training. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're a Muslim, but whether you're Taoist, or it's just decent upbringing. And so we can remember that, for example, if we take the 6 paramitas, what are they? Generosity of spirit, discipline, enough discipline, some effort, some insight, some understanding, some time to contemplate or meditate, and energy. You have to eat well and sleep well, do your best to stay healthy so you can do this kind of work. So those are all taken for granted here. It's taken for granted that you're a good person and that you've matured enough. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do any of the work. And so maybe the 4 agreements is a good doorway. It'll wake you up enough to say, hey, maybe I should pay attention to my spirit. It's not just my body and my friends and my bank account. So, yeah, that's all taken for granted. Jesus put it beautifully. Say it again?
It's not what goes into the mouth of man that defiles him, but what comes out of the mouth of man.
Yeah. That. And how do the Sufis put it? They say something about a knife under the tongue or something like that.
Oh, Hadrat Ali says
At any rate, the message
what
is
is it?
pretty
The
clear.
tongue. Yeah.
Don't just go blurting
Yeah,
out
yeah,
anything
yeah.
that comes to mind. And be generous in your spirit. Be disciplined with your own impulses. And that's going to require some effort on your part. And if you don't have enough insight to do that, then you may be listening to the wrong YouTube right now. You need to go back to real basics. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The
My last question for being impeccable with the word was about idle chit chat. So I noticed that I engage in a lot of just chatter, basically, with other people, which is just, I don't know, the regular things that you talk about each day.
All right, so that's important to note. And then the important thing is to be sensitive. This is hard for younger people. I know it was very hard for me. But if you can imagine a energy monitor in the back of your skull, it looks like this. Let's see, good, bad. All right, forgive the crudeness. All right, so here we have a little dial. It's like a water meter. And on one side it's full and it's good. And on the other side it's empty and it's not good or bad. And what you do is you must be alert, aware, and conscientious enough and sensitive enough to determine whether or not the net is energy, positive energy, of increase in energy, a decrease in energy, or neutral. Now, when you're young, most things are going to be neutral, or they're going to be obviously energy drains or energy pluses. But when you're young, that neutral band is going to be much wider than when you're older. And so, but you can accelerate that by developing the capacity to monitor your own energy and the quality of that energy. And so if you leave a small talk, and there's nothing wrong with small talk. I mean, that's what kind of keeps society together, right? That's what gossip is for some people. But for the serious Dharma student, that stops to be interesting, and it becomes an energy drain. And so energy is very important, and that's actually one of the paramitas. Let me explain to folks. The paramitas are these way of describing these little qualities, what are called in some traditions virtues, by which you cross from this shore of mundane suffering to the other shore of liberation, freedom, and frankly, bliss. Later, it becomes clear that you're both this shore, that shore, and the river. But as an expedient, there's these 6 little boats, and those are generosity of spirit and other generosity. Generosity with your time, generosity with your money, perhaps generosity with your labor. And then we have discipline. You need a certain amount of discipline so you don't just flop around all over the place. Effort. You got to. This work does require some effort. Contemplation, meditation, where you spend some time getting to know your mind and creating a space between your mind and what observes your mind, which is, this is you, this is your mind. They're not the same thing. And then we have the energy notion. And this is where the gossip or the small talk comes in. You got to guard your energy, and in a subtle way. Okay, and then all of that, the final paramita, since I'm on those, would be insight, which is understanding what's going on here. Okay? Sorry for the ad.
Okay.
That's a little ad for Buddhist virtues. But actually, every genuine tradition has something like that. Okay?
Okay. Let's go to the second of the 4 agreements, which is tied to something you said earlier. Don't take anything personally.
Okay, so on the surface, don't take anything personally means, don't take it personal, man. Don't get offended. It's not about you. Everybody's not just thinking about you all the time. You're not the center of the world. And a lot of times people just woke up on the wrong side of the bed, or they're angry with their wife, or they're angry with their husband, and they're taking it on you. Don't take it personally. Fair enough. The book does a great job with that kind of stuff. From a dharmic point of view, this assumes a self and a person. And so what one would do as a Dharma student would start to understand, well, what is a self that's taking things personally? Is there a self? And if it exists, how does it exist? What's it made of? Is it mutable or not? Is it real or not? Or is it just something that's been hobbled together in this vast and mysterious universe to help one get along, with other humans, perhaps, or with society or whatever? How much is this thing really needed? And what one ends up finding is that the self is the root of all suffering, frankly, and that it's identification, the process of thought and identification. You could call that yourself everything that you put mind to: my car, my husband, my kids, my house, my mortgage, my asthma, whatever it is you put a "my" to. That process of thought is what creates the self, and the self is what creates suffering. And so when the Buddhists are very famous for saying, don't be attached. They could almost as easily say, don't be attached to the notion of self as you imagine it to be, because as you progress in this work, that whole thing is going to mutate in your understanding into something totally different than what you imagine right now. And so don't take things personally. To that, I would just add, for the intermediate Dharma student, find out who that person is that's taking things that way also. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
All right. Questions?
I have some follow-up questions.
Good. Go ahead.
So I've noticed, I've done this repeatedly. I still do this, digging into the self. I've tried to find the thing many times, and I come up short each time, or at least what I do find is not what I thought it was before. But but there are some things I notice that are very like quote, self concept reinforcing, and other things that take away from that.
Correct.
So,
And taking things personally is at the top of that list, right? But go ahead.
yeah, yeah. So, so for example, like somebody, this one gets me a lot, is when somebody expresses disapproval of like quote me, then that thought will stick around for a little while. It's been doing it less and less and less, but still, I get this. I
Sure.
feel that somebody else has been
Totally natural.
disapproving of me or my behavior.
Totally
Then I go to
natural.
work. As I'm working, I think about uh, whatever the interaction was, the things they said. Sometimes I'll try to undercut them in my thoughts to be like, well, they don't know what they're talking about, or they're actually worse than me on this. They're a hypocrite, criticizing them, or trying to boost myself up. And then other thoughts are self-deprecating, and each of like being like, maybe they're right, blah, blah, blah. And each of these is reinforcing. So earlier you said that being impeccable with your
Well, wait a
word
minute.
is
Before you
very
go there,
tied.
before you go there,
Okay.
what happens when somebody says something positive about you or reinforcing to yourself? What happens then?
So
Does it make you
similar things, but yeah. So it depends. This has also been dissipating, but I get flattered
right? You feel good for a
often.
while. All right, that's natural human
Yeah.
circumstance. You want to
Yeah.
avoid what you don't like and get more of what you do like. All right, go ahead.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, you said earlier that the whole concept of self is very tied up with thoughts, and with with the idea of being impeccable with your word is important with that. Could you explain that further?
No, I was speaking more of the second uh, agreement. Don't take anything personally. But as you try and disassemble the self, then being impeccable with yourself, right? Am I following that thought? Am I rolling around in the happiness of having gotten a compliment? Am I mucking around in the mud because someone said that I sucked at this or that? You know, this up and down and up and down, this dependence on the opinion of others. It gets old, and as you get older, you realize that the whole thing's unnecessary. Or as you get wiser, the whole thing's unnecessary. So I'm not sure what the question is. In terms of not taking things personally, as a first step, just observe what makes you want more, go towards, hold on to, and what makes you want less, avoid, and have less of. And then watch your mood for the beginning, and then you can watch your energy in both of these, in all of these situations. So I guess impeccability
So,
with word or honesty with yourself would be to be able to monitor this, and then be honest with yourself when you failed to monitor it and you've just rolled around in the mud, or flew around in the trees, depending on whether you're sad or happy.
so I have a question about the digging into why part.
Okay.
Um, so like if I get this disapproval, because I've done this a few times, and I don't want to be speculating, but I feel like I'm speculating sometimes. When I get this thought of like I'm hanging out with somebody, they say something disapproving of me, and then I feel bad about myself about it, or I'm
That's just,
scared of like feeling
that's just
ostracized,
self-indulgent.
stuff like that.
It's self-indulgent ego, devil talk.
But like the why part of it,
Well, if there's some
uh,
truth to it and you can
there's plenty of
improve,
theories.
if there's some truth to it and you can improve, do it.
Well, yeah,
Well, I'm taking that for
that
granted.
makes sense.
I'm taking for granted that we've got grown-ups here, adults, that are interested in deepening their connection to the spirit, to truth, to God, Buddha,
So
Allah,
that's my
the
question is
way.
you would notice you observe that this is
And
These thoughts are passing and you're attached to them.
and you learn and you practice all of these as much as possible. And serious students will do it all the time. That will be the way they look at their life. And then they'll realize that the universe is actually, the whole thing's conspiring to bring them home. And they'll realize that the compliments and the insults and the person that say them and the whole day is full of these things, teaching and teaching and teaching. All things are teaching at all times. And so if the serious student adjusts their attitude towards life and they say, wait a minute, it's just one big teaching mechanism. And the whole thing's laid out perfectly for us. But we have to change our way of looking at it, that's all. And this thing about taking things personally and making the self, or this so-called self, this so-called ego, which any halfway serious person will tell you, well, that's made up by the mind as a way to like function in the world, or it's made up by the mind in order to make sense of the world. Well, that may be true, but now you have to disassemble it if you want to get to truth or to beauty or to any of the good stuff. But the main thing is that this universe is literally conspiring to bring you home, and that's what people just don't get. But once they get it, it doesn't go away. So good or bad, it's there to teach. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Follow up?
Now we can move on to the next agreement.
All right. What's the next agreement?
Don't make assumptions.
Well, I think, as I recall, Don Luis does a pretty good job of this in terms of interpersonally. The reason the book was so helpful to so many people, and the reason I can recommend it, although I don't know if I can recommend the third book, and the second book, unfortunately, signed a book contract, and then he gets involved in the corporate, demand machine, and you don't always get the same quality in the second or third or fourth book or the workbook or the. And then I think he died fairly early on, and his son took over. I know nothing about any of that, and that may all be great. I don't know. So don't make assumptions. Is that right?
Don't make assumptions.
All right. For the student on the way, they very quickly learn, hopefully, or they're not on the way, that many of their assumptions are just flat out wrong. That the world is not organized the way they imagine. That their mind is not organized the way they imagine. That what people have told them is not true. And that you can't make any assumptions. It's just like a scientist or a scientist or a great artist. You don't make assumptions. You work from first principles. But in this case, your assumptions that you are an ego, that you were born and you're going to die. The assumption that your mind is like encased in some kind of bone bowl. The limits of your mind, what you were here for, where you're going, all of these are assumptions. And for the most part, they're all wrong. And so don't make assumptions, because the goal here is to learn, and you can't learn. Remember the Zen story of it's very famous. I don't know if I need to repeat it. But some college professor comes and he wants to learn Zen. And the Zen master is, tea ceremony or something like that. He takes the pitcher and he starts pouring tea. And he just keeps pouring it, and the cup overfills, and tea goes all over the place. And finally the professor says, wait a minute, what are you doing? Stop. What are you doing? And the teacher, master or whatever, says, just like this cup, I can't put any more in this cup because it's full. I can't put anything into your mind because it's full. And what is it full of? It's full of assumptions. And so if you're a serious student of truth, you can't get there by assumptions, any assumptions, right? Or you can assume that it's there. You can assume that something exists. But after that, I'm not sure what you can assume in this marvelous world. It's far more mysterious than what people imagine, and far more benevolent and loving than people can countenance. But you got to get there. And you can't do that with assumptions. So don't make any assumptions. I mean, you know, what do they say in Zen? If you see a Buddha on the side of the road, kill him. I mean, that's literally a Zen adage. Because you assume you know what the Buddha looks like. You assume you know what the Buddha is. You assume you know what the teaching is about. You assume all kinds of things. Oh, it's to make you a good person. Well, that's not necessarily true. That may be a side effect, but that's not what it's for, necessarily, depending on the person. Okay? I mean, obviously, we can go on assumptions forever.
Yeah.
The world that people live in is, for the most part, just built of false assumptions and shared assumptions in the noosphere.
So one of the biggest problems with assumptions, though, is that you either don't know about them, or you don't know that you're making them often.
So assume that you
or
are.
You don't. That's a good point.
We assumed that the world was physical. How'd that work out? We assumed that time was not relative. How'd that work out? We assumed all kinds of things. We assumed that gravity was a force. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Literally, the world that most people live in is a world of just assumption. And the way is traveling along and discarding these assumptions one by one till you get to what's not an assumption, what's actually real, what's actually true, what's actually there. And that's not a matter of opinion or assumption or speculation or imagination. It's a totally different realm. And so you can't get there through assumptions. That would be how I would use that for Dharma students. You know, intermediate Dharma students.
Yeah, but for the Dharma student, almost anything you put into words has an assumption baked in. Like
Very
if
good.
You say,
excellent observation.
Yeah.
Truth will not be found in words.
If you were to say, I went to the store. Yeah.
Truth will not be found in words.
Well, then I guess the natural question is, what are you've said this multiple times, and you've said it on X. We have to get down to first principles. What are the first principles?
It's reality as is. It's this. It's right in front of you right now, this moment. It's this. Right here, right now. What's going on? Really. Not what you assume is going on, but what's really going on. It's always here. It's always right in front of you. And it's nowhere else. You can't grasp the mind in the past. You can't grasp the mind in the future. You can't grasp the mind in the present. That's the reality. Try it. And so you don't need an assumption. You don't need to make assumptions. It's self-evident if you just look. You can't grasp your mind. So, I mean, again, I don't want to get people all weirded out or think this is weird stuff, and that may have been a little bit premature. So let's move on, unless you got something else on assumptions. Try grasping your mind sometimes.
Try grasping it.
Yeah, good luck with that. All right.
Yeah, I'll save this one for
No,
later.
go ahead.
Okay,
go ahead.
next.
Go ahead. Let's see what we can do.
Well, this popped into my mind because it keeps messing with me, and I'm thinking I'm making some assumptions with it. often, but this veers off topic a little bit, often are described are the two modes of awareness: discriminating consciousness and original uncontrived formless awareness. This is especially prominent in Thomas Cleary's A Secret of the Golden Flower, the distinguishment between these two.
Mm-hmm.
The discriminating consciousness, what is that? Because
okay, I'm going to make it simple.
So
I'm going to simplify it at the level that I think it'd be the most useful.
Okay.
For you and for folks. Just think of it as judging. What judges? What judges this good, that bad, this beautiful, that ugly, this desirable, that undesirable? What does all that judging? And how much of your life is spent judging? Yourself or others or this or that? It's so tiresome. So just look at it that way for now. That's the expedient. Later, you'll understand the relationship of those two, discriminating consciousness from foundational consciousness. But see, you've made a distinction. You've created a duality. But I don't. That will get too deep and heavy for folks. But for now, just look at judgment. How much time do you spend judging with your mind?
And you don't just mean judging like judging other people. You mean judging like, oh, that's a really tall building.
No, I meant judging. Good, bad.
Good, bad.
Beautiful,
Okay.
ugly, desirable, undesirable. Want more, want less. You know,
Okay.
so if you're impeccable with yourself and you're willing to let go of your personal affinities, you can look at your judgment of people, places, things, idea, everything, and then get rid of some assumptions about what your thinking life is really like and what thought really is. So just for the moment, for the time being, replace discriminating consciousness with judging mind, judgmental mind. We're going to have to wrap up pretty quick.
All right, the last agreement.
Yes, sir.
The last agreement is always do your best.
Yeah, why not? Don't waste time. Don't be sloppy. Treat yourself with some respect, for God's sake. Treat your life with some, forgive me, some respect. And for Dharma students, this is part of honoring your word, honoring yourself. You know, when he talks about honoring, as I recall, it wasn't just honoring your word. It was honoring yourself, right? Honoring your spirit. Otherwise, who wants to be a slob in the spiritual realm? It's like being a slob in science or in art. I mean, that's just wasting time. And time is the one currency, is the final currency. And so do your best would mean do your best at, what are the ones? I lost the list. Do your best at being honest about whether or not you're following thoughts, depending on whether you, and figure out why you follow some and not others. Do your best when you're making small talk to monitor your energy and see, well, is this, and not just yours, but the general energy, is this something that's positive or negative or neutral and just wasting time? Or is this something that we're giving, love or affection or tenderness or whatever? There's reasons for small talk, a lot of reasons, but if you're just self-indulging, which is what most of it is, then you should look at that too, right? Just be honest, right? And then don't make assumptions about this world, because do your best not to make assumptions. It's not easy. You're assuming, for example, you know what yourself is. You're assuming you know what the purpose of this universe is. You assume that you can't find out why you were born. You assume all kinds of things all the time, and many of these things defeat you before you've even started. People are killed by their assumptions. And you know, we could talk about it in the intermediate Dharma realm, or we could talk about it as a pragmatic matter. In this, as you got to learn in this world, or you're not gonna do well. And then you're stuck with whatever neuroses or idiocies your parents gave you, right? Among others. Or you're stuck in the swamp of the noosphere with all of its vileness and all of its, you know, mental garbage that's accumulated over the years. So you want to be able to, like a lotus flower, blossom above that, above the swamp. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you do your best to do that, to identify it and rise above it, and do your best in dedicating your intent. This is the most important. Do your best. If you're insincere in your intent, you're going to get exactly what you're going to get is exactly indexed to how sincere you are. People don't know this fact. Without sincere intent, you go nowhere. With lukewarm intent, you stay basically nowhere. And with no intent, you just flop around and, you know, just a life of suffering. But there is a path beyond suffering, you know, and it's been traveled before, and it's open to anybody, but they must be sincere. And they can't be lazy. Unfortunately, most people don't meet those criteria, so they aren't serious students. That's why it's relatively rare to find people that are woken up, because it's hard to find people that are sincere and not, you know, lazy. I don't want to sound too harsh, but I'm trying to get across to people that this, like everything else for humans, not everything, but many of the things of value for humans take some effort, personal effort, and delaying your gratification, not eating your cake before dinner, not procrastinating, sitting down and doing something that's difficult at first, but then it gets easier as you go along, and then it starts to be a joy. And then as you start to open, you start to understand what this universe is about and how it actually works, then you're open to learning, to growing, to understanding, and then you're well on your way. So the Four Agreements, I think, is a great intro for everybody or anybody in the Western world, at least, to these things. How are we doing? Am I still
That's
on
good.
Do Your Best? I can't remember. I don't know what I'm on.
That was Do Your Best.
Okay. Anything else before we stop? Yeah, do your best at the six paramitas, right? Do your best to be generous. Do your best to be disciplined. Do your best to contemplate things. Maybe occasionally meditate to separate the self from the mind, or the you from the mind. Do your best with your energy. Monitor it. Eat well. Exercise. You know, do what you can to sleep well, etc. And cultivate insight. Do your best. That's what's frankly required. Sorry. This isn't like A, B, C, D. I mean, A, B, C, F. It's not like college courses. It's more like either you're sincere and you mean it and you're impeccable with your own word, with yourself, or you're insincere. You don't really mean it. Oh, it'd be nice. Wouldn't it be nice not to have suffering in my life? And you go nowhere, basically. You just flop over like the New Age. You know? Not everybody flopped over. Do you see what I'm saying? Some people were sincere.
Yeah.
All right, sir? So do your best.
Yeah, that does it.
To be sincere. Anything else?
Not for now, no.
All right. Vaya con Dios, mi amigo.